the sun's curiosity about all kinds of living organism. In 367, aged 17, Aristotle went to Athens, the first city of Greece for all kinds of education. Apart from the usual teachers of rhetoric and philosophy, there was Plato's Academy, a gathering of like-minded intellectuals drawn from all over the Greek world. Here, Aristotle found enough to occupy him for the next 20 years, until the death of Plato in 347, at which point direction of the Academy passed to Speusippus, while its greatest teacher, Aristotle, left and went to live at Assos, near Troy, in what is now Turkey. A little later, King Philip II of Macedonia wanted a personal tutor for his son Alexander, and Aristotle took on the job. It sounds like quite a menial task, but Plato had taught that there could only be good government if philosophers were kings or kings were philosophers. Plato himself had tried briefly, and with marked lack of success, to act as guide to Dionysius II, the young ruler of Syracuse. Now, it seems, Aristotle thought he should follow the same path. His pupil became Alexander the Great, who soon became one of the greatest army commanders the world has seen. But his frenetic drive to conquer half the world left little time to spare for thinking. If any king was going to be a philosopher, it was not Alexander. In 335 BC, Aristotle returned to Athens and set up his own school called the Lyceum. It had a colonnade called the Peripatos, or walk, which led Aristotle's followers to become known as the Peripatetics. He spent the next 12 years directing studies and research, but on the death of Alexander in 323, Athens was engulfed by one of its periodic waves of anti-Macedonian feeling. Aristotle was threatened with prosecution and decided to leave. It was the Athenians who had put Socrates to death some 75 years before, and Aristotle was determined not to let them, as he put it, sin a second time against philosophy. He died the following year in the city of Chalcis, aged 62. Aristotle's writing, sadly, does not quite match the sparkle of Plato's dialogues. The poet Thomas Gray was unkind enough to say that reading Aristotle is like eating dried hay, but we should probably blame the destruction of ancient libraries for this rather than the man himself. For hundreds of years after his death, Aristotle was praised as a fine stylist on the basis of works written in a more digestible form for a broad public. But these are now lost, and what we possess are those that were passed around among the inner circle of Aristotle's own school of pupils. They are densely argued with technical vocabulary and no kind of polish or ornament, certainly no jokes or anecdotes. In fact, they've often been described as lecture notes, the bare bones of his philosophy, which would have been fleshed out and expanded when delivered orally. Against this, we can be grateful for the marvellous clarity and acuteness of Aristotle's thought. He is never one for mystification or deliberate obscurity. One other point to bear in mind before we begin to listen to this. Everyone, even the greatest of philosophers, is a product of his time. No matter how wide the range of Aristotle's studies, he was still confined within the boundaries of what could be thought at that point in human history. So, what were the assumptions and prejudices common to all Greeks in the 4th century BC? Obviously, there were too many to mention all of them here, but within the area covered by Aristotle's Ethics and Politics, 2 topics stand out in particular. First, slavery. This was universally present in the ancient world, not just in Greece. Although prisoners taken in war might be enslaved, most Greeks were not happy with the idea of fellow Greeks being slaves, and most of their slaves were foreigners imported from abroad. Greeks commonly looked down on non-Greeks as inferior, and Aristotle was no exception. The main reason was not racial in the genetic or biological sense, but cultural. The Greeks were proud of their independent way of life, carried on in small communities under a strict rule of law. They contrasted their own habits of mind with the slavish mentality, as they saw it, of Eastern cultures, where large populations were held in subjection under a ruler who was above the law. To the Greeks, they seemed no different from slaves under the ownership of a master. The Persian Empire was the most obvious example. The policy of Alexander, when he conquered that empire, was to treat Greeks and Persians the same. But however enlightened that may seem to us,